All right, hello everybody. Welcome to our next lesson here. This is America after World War II. This is for our unit or the unit post-war America. All right, everyone, here's our objectives and standards: to identify problems Americans faced following the war and to analyze the factors that created a booming economy. And we have our standards as well, so please take a look at them. Our desired result: what changes and challenges did the United States face after World War II? Okay, so in 1946, after the war, 10 million men and women were released and returned home from war. Remember, we discussed this back during World War II, that veterans had been receiving educational benefits and loans for homes and farms from the GI Bill of Rights, which was passed in 1944 before the end of the war. With that said, there was a housing crisis in 1945 and 1946, so following the war and at the end of the war. And many veterans were living in tiny apartments, or they were forced to live with family members. Suburbs. Henry James Kaiser and William Levitt, both developers, responded to the housing crisis, and I apologize if I'm not pronouncing their names rightly, or correctly, I should say. Kaiser mass-produced houses using assembly line production techniques. Levitt sold houses at a cheaper price in small communities outside the cities. These communities would later become known as suburbs. Here's a picture of what one of the suburbs looked like. You can see how many of the homes were designed the same. You can see how the streets are kind of lined out equal to each other, parallel to each other. But again, these were small communities that we know as suburbs, and obviously we still have suburbs today. So this is beginning of suburbia, as they call it. Now, the country went from a wartime economy to a peacetime economy, and that can be difficult for a couple of reasons. Many Americans found themselves without jobs at defense industries because since the war was over, a lot of these people were not needed anymore to work, so many of them were laid off and lost their jobs. Remember that we also have veterans coming home from war who are also looking for jobs. So we have laid off workers and veterans competing for jobs, so a lot of unemployment at the time. Another thing that was going on was prices were skyrocketing as demand for limited items increased. Things like coffee and sugar that people couldn't buy during the war because they were limited to those resources for rationing purposes. As people are not able to buy those things, demand is increasing and prices are going to skyrocket. Now, to kind of help alleviate this problem, Congress is going to put in price limits like they did during World War II to help with the rising costs, and this will help alleviate some of those issues. Okay, now to kind of help with the recovery during these economic hardship times, Americans had saved money during the war. Remember, we talked about that during World War II. Since people weren't able to buy as much or spend as much, they're able to save their money. With the savings they now have, many were able to afford things like automobiles and houses. So despite early economic struggles, Americans began to bounce back, and this post-war boom is going to start. Companies began hiring to keep up with the demand for goods. So since people were demanding more things, companies are going to be able to hire more people. And also with the defense industries that we talked about on the last slide, this growing concern of the expansion of the Soviet Union helped defense industries also hire new people and expand as well. And again, the Marshall Plan, which we talked about in our last unit, in Europe also led to stronger markets overseas, so Americans could export more of those goods over there and make more money. Okay, so we're still going to, like I said, the post-war economy is booming, it's starting to grow, but there are still other economic struggles, and one happened to be with labor. So despite positive growth, President Truman had to deal with other economic conditions. Like we just said, he had to deal with labor strikes. These strikes took place in, get my mouse here and draw here for you. They took place in steel, coal, and the railroads. So those are the three major areas or industries where strikes were taking place. Okay. Now Truman had typically agreed with unions, but he's not going to allow them to shut down the country. So he actually threatened to have them drafted and placed as soldiers required to work by the president. So he's kind of using his military power a little bit to do that. He also thought of having the government take over the industries. That way they couldn't shut the country down. So if the government took over the industries, life could still continue on. But before he could propose the idea to Congress, the industries, I think, kind of, were a little afraid that what Truman was proposing, and they do end the strike. So Truman was also a strong supporter of civil rights. In 1946, President Truman established a President's Commission on Civil Rights. Now, under the recommendation of the group, Truman asked for certain reforms. He asked for a federal anti-lynching law. He asked for a ban for poll taxes. What poll taxes were, and we'll talk about this in our civil rights unit when we get to it, poll taxes required African Americans to pay a certain fee to be able to go into the poll to vote. A lot of times, many African Americans were unable to pay this poll tax, so they were not able to vote, which is illegal. You cannot stop someone from voting, but Southern governments in the South at this time were finding ways to prevent African Americans from voting through discrimination. He also urged a creation of a permanent civil rights commission. Now, Congress refused to pass the measures, and they also refused to integrate the armed forces. During World War II, we had black troops. As you remember, we had African American troops and Mexican American troops, but they were separate from white troops. They weren't allowed to serve in the same units or groups or whatever. So Truman had asked Congress to integrate them, to allow African Americans and whites to serve in the same military units. So Congress did refuse this. So Truman says he's had enough. He decides to take action himself. In July of 1948, he ordered an executive order that integrated the armed forces and called for an end to discrimination for the federal government. Okay, so people who were hired by the federal government wasn't just going to be white people or whatever. It was going to, they had to start hiring African Americans as well. And another thing that happened is the Supreme Court also ruled that African Americans could not be banned from living in certain neighborhoods. Okay, so before this, some neighborhoods or developments were forbidding African Americans to purchase homes in those areas. The case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that was illegal. You cannot stop someone from living where they want to live. All right, so let's talk about the election in 1948. Although some Democrats were concerned about Truman's lack of progress in government or just a lot of different things that were going on, they do decide to nominate President Truman for election. Remember that in the southern parts of the country, the southern states, many of them, like we said, were against civil rights. So to protest these recent civil rights measures that President Truman had enacted, Southern Democrats formed a states' rights political party known as the Dixiecrats. Okay, and they are going to look at a man by the name of J. Strom Thurmond. He is the governor of South Carolina, so they're going to nominate him to run against President Truman as well. There was also the Progressive Party, which had Henry A. Wallace, who was a former vice president. And the Republicans are going to nominate a man by the name of Thomas E. Dewey, who was the New York governor at the time. So we have 4 different people running for president in 1948. Now, many did not think Truman could win re-election, but if you look at the electoral map here, you'll see that Truman's in the blue here, and he did kind of shock the nation. He did win a good portion of the Midwest and western parts, which is where Truman was from, a good part of the central parts of the United States, and he also did win a lot of the southern states, which many people did not think he'd be able to do, again, due to his role in civil rights. You can see Dewey won most of the Northeast and parts of the Midwest, and then we also have Strom Thurmond, who won those southern states for the Dixiecrats. Okay, and that picture there is showing you that many newspapers and things like that and the press did not believe that Truman could win re-election. So here he is holding up a paper from, I believe it's the Chicago Daily Tribune, which states that Thomas Dewey had defeated Truman. So they printed this paper ahead of time before the election results, before they came out that day. And so this is Truman obviously laughing and smiling at this because, again, many people didn't think he was going to be able to win, and the paper actually publicized this, that Dewey defeats Truman. So it was kind of a mistake on their half. So I think the media had learned from this a little bit, but in other cases they don't. Sometimes they do predict too early the results. But either way, this is one of the most historic pictures in American history of Truman kind of smiling and laughing at this kind of prediction that was wrong. So after his stunning victory, Truman proposed broad economic ideas as an extension to Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal. Remember, Truman was the vice president for Roosevelt. So he comes up with this thing called the Fair Deal. Okay, so this is one of your other vocab words, the Fair Deal. And what he called for was a healthcare insurance compulsory program that was nationwide, so requiring everyone in America to have health insurance. You can probably tie this into the present with what President Obama and Congress had done a couple of years ago with the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. So this kind of comes to play later on in American history, as you can see, but it was an idea that was floated around prior to President Obama as well. Truman also looked to support farmers with a crop subsidy system, but both of these measures are going to be defeated in Congress. Okay, a couple of things he was able to do, though, in terms of this fair deal he proposed was he was able to raise the minimum wage, he was able to propose economic relief to cities, extend Social Security, and provide flood and irrigation relief to those parts of the country that needed it. All right, our closure. What changes and challenges did the United States face after World War II? So think about some of the changes, such as the suburbs. Think about what kind of happens in terms of civil rights for African Americans, and think about the election of 1948, the outcome of that, and some of the plans that the government has as well. And that'll help you answer your questions. All right, please try your best on the questions that follow. Let me know of any questions or concerns, and I hope to talk to you all soon. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.